What's up, everybody? Dave here. And in this episode of the podcast, I'm going to continue with reading for you from my 3 current in-progress books in progress. You can find each of these on the Deadbeat Philosophy Substack page, deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. In the last 2 episodes, I read from theoretical texts that dealt with animality and the human-animal relationship on the one hand, and with the Kanthropocene and with Kant and the environmental crisis on the other. The one that I'm going to read for you today is different from the other 2. It's a very personal text. I call it a Bipolar Manifesto. And the idea here is to think and write and create philosophically around the idea of being bipolar and of having bipolarism as an identity. So I'm somebody with bipolar disorder, and I've lived with that for a long time. But up until very recently, I've never approached my bipolarism through a philosophical lens. There's so much that could be said through philosophy about the topic, and certainly in my own self-understanding of what it means to be somebody with mental illness or with a mental disorder. I put that in quotation marks because I think that philosophy actually allows you to question even these aspects of yourselves, and that you shouldn't take diagnoses for granted. And there's this question about whether mental illnesses are social productions or come from purely genetic or epigenetic factors, and like, what is the origin of mental disorders? Is it more in society itself that creates individuals who don't fit that well within it, or that somehow rub up against society in the wrong way, thereby exhibiting mental illness? Or is mental illness a matter of something that develops within the brain chemistry or the minds of individuals? Certainly both the social and the individual theory of mental illness have something correct to them, and perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's very interesting that it's a matter of interpretation, and that how we think about ourselves within these categories is something that I think can and should be interpreted. It's true that there are psychiatrists and psychologists and experts and professionals and diagnostic and standards manuals that have gone through various editions. There's a whole edifice of medical, scientific doctrine and ideas surrounding mental illness and mental disorders today. And I don't mean to call those into question per se. I think that that has a lot of value and a lot of impetus behind it. But it is the case that if you step back and think about these issues historically and philosophically, that is, as concepts, as ideas and concepts that can be played off one another, as questions that can be raised, then even that contemporary psychological medical consensus is at least open to philosophical debate, interpretation, and questioning. And the phenomenon that we're dealing with here when it comes to human identity, when it comes to how we understand ourselves, whether you're mentally ill or not, or have a mental disorder or not, bipolarism or otherwise, you have a mind, you have a mental life, you have something happens within your mental bodily interface, and you can account for that in different ways. So philosophy can step in there in opening some space, a little bit of breathing room and air between medicine and science and maybe folk psychology and popular culture and individual experience. Philosophy opens this different realm of questioning that I think can be not just important and interesting, and not just arriving perhaps at some philosophical truth or insight about bipolarism, but can be therapeutic. I'll talk about this in a future podcast that focuses on this more specifically, apart from this particular text or set of texts that I'm going to read for you. But philosophy is very therapeutic and has been one of the ways through which I've understood myself, and I've understood what it means to have ups and downs in mood, and to grapple with that and think about that. So this text, of Bipolar Manifesto, that I'm going to turn to now, then I only have three sections completed so far to share with you, although there are a number of others in the works. Let me know what you think about this, regardless of your relationship to bipolar disorder or what it means to be bipolar. I hope that you find this theoretically and philosophically interesting. And just a quick note that some of the material that I'm going to share with you here could be triggering to some people, I suppose, or it could be sensitive, at least, if you, depending on your own relationship to these ideas. So, for instance, suicide and self-harm are part of the bipolar worldview and experience, and in some ways those are reflected here too. So we'll see about that. Enjoy, 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 enjoy. A Bipolar Manifesto, Section 1, What This Book Plans to Do. The idea behind A Bipolar Manifesto is to develop new concepts out of my own described first-person experience with certain aspects of bipolar life. This is a philosophically driven attempt to produce a new way of speaking about what it means to be bipolar in our society, not from the outside as medical psychological approaches necessarily do, but from the inside with a sort of fidelity or attribution of primacy to the bipolar experience itself, such as it can be described and with allowance made, such as is possible for that experience to speak for itself and through these concepts. For the most fundamental misunderstanding of bipolar experience is to do as both Descartes and Kant did, but which Wollstonecraft and Kierkegaard did not. To deny that bipolar experience can think or think reasonably. For bipolar experience, it is held here, is not the privation of reason. It is rather reason's mixture with what it itself takes to be the irrational other, lesser half, but which really is simply other than reason, reason's alien other, just behind the veil, sometimes called God, sometimes called magic, sometimes called madness, sometimes called nature. This should not be considered a kind of self-help book. Indeed, while I never recommend or endorse any sort of self-harm, or other harm for that matter, the following sections will at times explore the impulses toward or trajectories of self-harm and even self-killing or suicide. At least not in a simple or straightforward way, this text does not seek to oppose itself to, or to invite readers to oppose themselves to, those impulses or trajectories. Plenty of other books do that and do it more effectively than I can claim to do. The goal here is to explore, understand, and provide an account from within, and the world of within cannot, I hold, be genuinely explored, understood, or accounted for if this imperative to oppose harm is assumed from the outset and brought, as it were, in from the outside and given both authority and safe harbor. There is another sense in which this is not a self-help book. This is true of many works of philosophy on many subjects. Philosophy can function as a sort of self-help, assistance, therapy, tool, remedy, whatever, but it does not always do so, and sometimes the effect of a work of philosophy is precisely to make one's life harder. In other words, not to help at all. This was so, for example, with Socrates, though perhaps not so with Plato. For Socrates, the primary goal of philosophy was to examine one's life, not to improve one's functioning within the world one finds oneself in, which, in rough, is the common goal of the self-help industry today. Hence, I find it useful to post the following signboard above the entrance to the cave we now beckon the reader within. As Dante did in his Inferno, abandon all hope for self-help, ye who enter here. For bipolar humans do think and do have thoughts, and I hold that those thoughts are qualitatively and not just quantitatively distinct. They have not adequately been explored and described. What we mostly have are accounts from the outside, largely in the sciences, that is, in psychology, psychiatry, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, demography, and so on, or else in the realm of arts and culture, that is, in popular culture, the visual, written, auditory, and performance arts, history, religion, philosophy, and more. I intend, therefore, here to provide something novel, a philosophical account from within this state of disorder, and one that attempts to value the distinctive form of life that it is to live there within. That this account is philosophical does not mean it is not also autobiographical, which it must also necessarily to some extent be. But the autobiographical element will only be mustered and developed in order to accompany and complement the development of the philosophical account. This is not a glimpse into the diary of the author, and there are many domains of my life that I have chosen not to explore in what follows. Of course, there already exist a number of highly readable, highly valuable autobiographical texts that offer certain accounts from within the bipolar experience. We do not mean this text primarily as an entry in that literature. We rather take this text as an entry in what might be called, speaking both awkwardly and anachronistically, as we shall often have recourse to do ahead, the philosophical approaches to madness of various forms literature. that one. This is itself a long and valuable literature in its own right, spanning from Diogenes to Augustine to Hildegard von Bingen, to Burton, to Kierkegaard, to Nietzsche, to Freud, to Foucault, and beyond, just to mention a certain Western intellectual trajectory. I shall at times draw from, engage with, and either absorb or reject certain aspects of these predecessor accounts and what follows, always with a healthy dollop of gratitude for the opportunity to do so. But this is not a scholarly book, and while I shall always strive for my own sort of accuracy, scholars of any of these predecessor thinkers may well have gross misgivings about our inclusion of them here. If so, then so be it. It is hoped that such a philosophical account from within, limited and partial to the author's frame of reference though it may be, may in turn prove valuable, and perhaps even highly valuable, to some others down the line. A Bipolar Manifesto, Part 2, The Bipolar Appeal of Kant. As a bipolar person, I've been drawn to Immanuel Kant's philosophy since I first learned of it as a young person, around the tender age of 17, I would reckon. I think part of its appeal early on was that, during times in my life when I've felt driven to push away from my own madness towards sanity, Kant's philosophy has at times to me seemed the very opposite of madness, and the very paragon of sanity, a system of rational control that accounts for everything. I'm still just as drawn to Kant's thought today as I was back then, but I no longer understand it as the opposite of madness. I understand it, and I mean this in a gentler way than it sounds, as a form of madness in its own right, a madness that takes itself in a myriad of sophisticated and complicated ways to have achieved the elimination or containment of madness. I do not presume to think that the idiosyncratic relationship I have to Kant's thought ought easily to translate or resonate for others. Indeed, only a small share of the people who care to think about the history of philosophy are bipolar, and even for them, Kant might come across in an entirely different way. In this sense, what I am expressing here is not meant as the staking out of a generalizable philosophical position, but rather the making explicit of a zone of intelligibility that has always, in one way or another, seemed implicit to me. However, I do think there is also a broader point to be made here, and this is the following. The madness present in Kant's philosophy, which Kant does his best to eliminate and contain, but which Kant is ultimately unsuccessful in eliminating and containing, is the madness of our own global human society today. I'll repeat. The madness present in Kant's philosophy, which Kant does his best to eliminate and contain, but which Kant is ultimately unsuccessful in eliminating and containing, this is the madness of our own global human society today. The generative feature of this madness on all levels appears to run parallel to, and perhaps may in fact be identical to, an enduring phenomenon that, in another context, I argue links Kant and the global contemporary world. In that other project, which I addressed in the last episode of the podcast, I call this line of thinking the Kantian paradox, and this paradox is simply this. When adopting the position of free and reasonable persons, knowers, actors, and hopers, which Kant's philosophy, and with it many of the concepts, ideologies, and institutions of our present, invites and requires us to do, we hold ourselves to be both entirely natural beings, qua human beings or human animals, and extra-natural beings, as rational beings. This is a paradox because a forced both-and equals paradox. One cannot have one's cake and eat it too. In seeking to inhabit both the natural and extra-natural spaces, we end up truly inhabiting neither. This has engendered a great many ills for us, as well as a great many benefits. But in the end, while this has become a default form of life in the Kanthropocene and has grown indispensable for us, it has left us radically unable to genuinely respond to the many acute planetary and societal crises that we ourselves, as a global human society, are facing today, most of which, perhaps all of which, we ourselves have called into being. We're a mixture of Prometheus and Sisyphus, tempered with some Hamlet, and you know how all those stories came to an end. All of this is also packed into Kant, and reading Kant as a bipolar person allows me to see, in an especially vivid way, how all of this is so. For it feels oddly familiar to me, structurally and directionally speaking. The polarized logic of Kant's system resonates with the polarized logic of my world. Dave's world, it's party time. Excellent. Bonus points if you get the reference. Two bipolar tuning forks harmonized on opposite sides of a room, triggered into simultaneous vibration by a single burst of equidistant sound. This isn't to say that, because Kant resonates with me this way, I enjoy Kant especially much, or agree especially much with any of the various positions that he developed and defended over his long career as an author of philosophical works. Depending on how you count it, this spans from about 1747 to at least 1804. It's more complicated than that, of course, in just the same way that my relationship to myself is complicated, and complicated in particular by the bipolar nature of my lived experience. For instance, I don't always agree with things I think or do once my mood has shifted from one modal position along the bipolar spectrum to another. But even when I no longer adopt a position that an earlier mood version of myself did adopt, the earlier position will continue to have resonance for me. It will not have entirely faded away. Its resonance will continue. Kant's philosophy has a hard time accounting for something like the sort of resonance just described. For resonance is a matter of alignment amidst movement, of fuzzy, indeterminate meaning, of being called to something or of calling to something, not yet knowing how to answer or what an answer would even look like. Resonance, in the way I am using the concept here, is a bipolar relationship, but a non-fixed one. Resonance is fluid, liquid, ambiguous, gray. It has a non-fixed polarity. In Kant, by contrast, reason is fixed like a north star, and all human morality, value, truth, beauty, goodness is oriented toward reason like the little spindly arms of 8.2 billion pocket compasses, opened all at once from every human inhabited spot on the planet. For Kant, and I think for many, many people today, depending on how terms like reason and value are defined, this never changes, never has changed, never will change. There is a fixed polarity in Kant, with reason on one end and reason's polar opposite on the other. I argue in my 2022 book, Kant on the Human Animal, Anthropology, Ethics, Race, that reason's opposite, when we consider the matter in the context of the internal nature and character of the human being, is animality. But this anti-rational opposite can, depending on the context, just as well be figured as nature, emotion, inclination, the body, sensation, even imagination. All of these are, at one point or another, in Kant's system, and in our system today, don't you think? Aligned along a north-south polar axis with reason on top. Some may be lower down and closer to the South Pole than others, and indeed, all of these pieces shift and slide throughout Kant's long working career. But none of the others ever top reason. Reason's the top dog. Once again, Kant thought, spoke, and wrote about all of this with very few breaks for more than 50 years, 1747 to 1804. I'd hope that somebody would change at least some of their views over such a span of time, wouldn't you? Kant certainly did, but the fundamental axial bipolar orientation of his thinking is something that appears to have remained in place, at least on my reading, from 1766 and through to the end. There is, to sum up, something characteristic to Kant that resonates deeply with me as a bipolar person, and which I think also resonates with global human society today. The placement of reason, that is, sanity, at the top of the axis with virtually everything else, and certainly everything having to do with the body, emotion, passion, nature, animality, instinct, inclination, and so forth, that is to say, madness, placed below. This is something like Kant's signature philosophical superstructure. You could say that I have a love-hate relationship with Kant. I did write my dissertation on him, and I continue to publish on and teach about him today. But my reading of him all along has been a mixture of critical and defensive, negative and positive, probably a bit more on the critical negative side overall on balance, but who knows what the future holds. I don't like or agree with a lot of the things he thought, spoke, or wrote about. Love Kant, hate Kant, good Kant, bad Kant, up Kant, down Kant, red Kant, blue Kant. What answer do I for these questions hath depends on the day and whether I've taken my bath. Even though someone like me at times seems to be an impossibility in Kant's system of thought, that system nonetheless continues to resonate with me, personally and professionally, if I can still call myself a professional philosopher at all. You tell me. I still find great interest and value in thinking with, within, and against Kant's system. It's difficult to explain, but Kant helps me to better come to grips with myself as I am. From my bipolar point of view, he holds perpetual appeal. A Bipolar Manifesto 3. Bipolar is like wintering in Antarctica. Between February 1898 and March 1899, a Belgian ship and its international crew were trapped in ice on the western Antarctic peninsula. The ship was called the Belgica, and the crew were the first known human beings to spend the winter, pitch black from May to July, on the southernmost continent. The following year, the ship's surgeon and the sole American on board released a memoir of the ordeal, titled Through the First Antarctic Night. Inside, one finds before and after shots of 3 crewmen, including of the author himself. And if you look at these 3 photographs, I've posted them there in this post, but it's before the trip and after the trip, and the transformation of these 3 dudes after that winter, as documented in this photo, is really brutal, interesting, and severe. Imagine it. 13 months trapped in Antarctica with no means of communicating with the outside world, insufficient food, but plenty of water, a clear upside, am I right? An absolute scarcity of daylight or absolute abundance, depending on the time of year, and most critically of all, not enough handlebar mustache wax to last everyone through the winter. They've all got these kind of handlebar-y mustaches. What a nightmare! Cook says in the caption to the photo, the long night affected a radical transformation in our physiognomies, and this leads me to what especially interests me about all of this. You ask, but what is a physiognomic transformation, and who among us is susceptible to being transformed in this way? Terminologically, physiognomy amounts to the derivation of a certain knowledge, hence the nomos, from the observable physical features of a natural being, hence the physio-nomos. But conceptually, and in its most historically well-known and influential form, physiognomy is the derivation of knowledge of a human's inner, moral, or psychic character on the basis of their face. And so, a physiognomic transformation would be an apparent shift in a human's face over time, in a way that somehow tracks, reflects, or produces a parallel shift over time in that same human's character, from better to worse, from worse to better, or, less normatively, from character state A to character state B. Nowadays, among psychologists and others who study humans in the academy, the project and promise of physiognomy is rejected as outdated pseudoscientific quackery, as is the case with phrenology, the related but distinct science of determining human character from the measuring of the human head. Regarding Cook's claimed physiognomic transformation, it is not that, on the contemporary scientific consensus, there are no real transformations in physiology or in character, or even that there are no real connections between these transformations. For example, a traumatic injury might alter both of these in a person at the same time. It is rather, according to the contemporary scientific consensus, that there is no necessary causal, that is, more than correlative, repeated, structural, or essential connection between them. And for that reason, physiognomy, which, like phrenology, does posit such necessary connections between inner character and outer form, physiognomy does not pass contemporary scientific muster. But the fact that such theories are rejected by mainstream science today does not mean that they are rejected within the broader contemporary streams of popular culture, media, urban folklore, and ideology. Indeed, my sense as someone who has taught college courses about such themes for 15 years in 3 states and on 2 continents is that people today, young and old, do by and large accept that there is some deep and real connection between how someone looks, especially their face, and the quality of their character. This seems to be especially so when it comes to the perceived connection between criminality and certain sorts of facial structure. Take as an illustration of this the whole social media genre of ogling, mocking, and sometimes adoring publicly available mugshots of arrested criminals. All of this interests me here because the same sort of transformative physiognomic self-understanding adopted by Cook was, during that period, that is to say around 1900, also adopted when it came to bipolar people, then generally known as either the circularly insane or as manic depressives. Consider a before and after shot from the 1899 book Nervous and Mental Diseases by the American medical doctors Archibald Church and Friedrich Peterson. Or a sequence involving a 40-year-old Russian woman from the 1900 book A Treatise on Mental Diseases by the American MD Henry J. Berkeley. Or, a bit later on, but still within the same broad physiognomic paradigm, a sequence from the 1921 book Manic Depressive Insanity and Paranoia by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who succeeded almost single-handedly in shifting medical scientific consensus toward the term and concept of manic depression. In all 3 cases, we see an extreme apparent facial physiognomic transformation in a human being who has circular madness or manic depression or bipolar. And the idea is that when their mood shifts, their face shifts, and you can trace the mood shift and the different attitudes of reason or unreason in their character, if you will. You can see the insanity on their face and the becoming insane, and the shifts of mood from one to another are themselves seen here to be physiognomic phenomena. See the pattern here? Bipolar disorder, manic depression, circular insanity, use whatever term you will, they're all historical constructs, involves not just a shift of mood, but, on this view, a deeper sort of physiognomic transformation, a shift you can see in the bipolar person's face, particularly when you compare before and after. And since bipolar is definitionally understood to be, even in this early phase of its modern medical psychiatric conceptualization, a matter of circularity and cycles, this before and after is really a before and after and before and after and before and after and so on. Okay, interesting enough, but is any of this legit? Do mood shifts parallel, whether reflective or giving rise to, certain necessary shifts in a person's face? On the one hand, there do seem to be undeniable links between face and mood, as with the relatively well-known genre of recent studies showing that smiling, even forced smiling, has a non-trivial ability to make a person feel happier, which prompts me to ask as the inverse of this, if I hold my face in a depressive stupor for a long enough time, will this end up making me depressed? Perhaps. But again, the essence of the physiognomic worldview is to assert not just a link, but a necessary link. And so, if prolonged and intentional smiling makes one happier, does being happy not just make one smile, but also permanently turn one's face into a happy face? And if, conversely, and I urge you to test this one at home, prolonged and intentional frowning makes one sadder, can being sad not just make one frown in an instant, but permanently turn one's face into a sad face? Ask yourself if you believe there to be a grain of truth to these broader claims. If you do, then physiognomy lives on somewhere in your heart. But don't beat yourself up about it. It lives on in all of our hearts on some level or another, given how history, ideology, folk psychology, common sense, and ingrained stigmatization are all tangled up in our lives as highly culturally impressionable children, and then as just as culturally impressionable adults. The interesting question for me is not, how can we rid ourselves of the enduring legacy of pseudoscientific physiognomy, even though that is a valuable question to ask. Instead, I'm interested to ask, how can the enduring legacy of pseudoscientific physiognomy be put to use, both to understand and to enhance the lived experience of bipolar people today? That is, might there actually be something liberating about conceiving bipolarism in physiognomic terms? For, if we are wont to deny the strict separation of mind and body in other areas of human life and society, say, when it comes to the physical effects of work-related stress and burnout, or to the disastrous way modern humans have tended to take themselves as rational minds exercising dominion over natural bodies. If we are wont to deny the strict separation of mind and body in these areas, then why would we assert a strict separation of mind and body when it comes to this? Put more personally, there is something in the spirit of Cook's Antarctic physiognomic self-understanding that appeals to me as a bipolar person, even if I don't regard that self-understanding as good science. The harrowing, physiology-altering ordeal he and his fellow crew endured over that dark Antarctic winter in 1898 is in fact an apt and powerful analog for the bipolar mood shift. Both can mess you up, and both will be seen on your face going forward. And the important lesson in both cases is the same. You were changed, but you made it through. So thanks very much for tuning in, everybody. I hope you appreciate this look at a Bipolar Manifesto and the first 3 sections of it. I'm going to continue to work on this book over the months and maybe even longer ahead. If you're a bipolar person, let me know what you think about this type of approach to your mental disorder. If you're somebody who's interested in the history of philosophy and in philosophical analyses, what do you think about the application of that to bipolar disorder? Whoever you are, I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day or evening or afternoon or morning. Bye-bye. A physiognomic transformation.
The Deadbeat Philosophy podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus, Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.